comfortable level. India remains as before absolutely well-governed, stable government and also very well, regulated financial market.
सेबी और आरबीआई तो दो संस्थाएं हैं जिनको जांच कराना जरूरी है, पर हम मानते हैं कुछ निष्पक्ष जांच की जरूरत है।
सेबी ने भी इनको फेल किया है, सरकार ने भी उनको फेल किया है, इसीलिए हम चाह रहे हैं कि एक जॉइंट पार्लियामेंट्री कमेटी का गठन हो।
And first up, an exclusive interview with Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. This is the first senior government official to speak on the Adani controversy, with Adani shares nosediving, and we're the only network in India right now which has the exclusive comments of the Finance Minister herself. This is what she said in an exclusive interview, the first to a private television channel right after the budget. She spoke exclusively to Network 18's Group Editor-in-Chief, Rahul Joshi.
Your budget was very well received by the markets. In fact, while you were speaking, the markets were really going up. But the rout in the Adani stocks somewhat spoiled the party. There is a general nervousness in the market. How does your government see this?
I look at the budget for having covered all the sections of the society. We've tried, and it has been a detailing that which has consumed a lot of time in preparation of this budget. The details is what has brought the difference in touching so many different sectors and segments of our society. We've got something on offer for each one of them. So therefore, if it's being received very well, I'm very glad. But of course, that motivates me to be able to now take it upon myself to better implement it down to the last person who's aimed at. So I would think the impact of the budget, the immediate impact of the budget on the market, and subsequent to, let's say, for whatever reason it trailed back, I think in the next few days the budget's impact will still continue to hold the markets high.
The opposition is taking aim at your government, saying that the banking and insurance companies have large exposure in Adani stocks. And the investors and the broader market is looking to you for some direction on this issue. Is our banking and insurance system resilient to take this shock?
I want to recall the words, coming from the horse's mouth has greater credibility. Both SBI and LIC have issued detailed statements. And I know the chairperson or the CMD has himself come out and explained how they are not overexposed or whatever they said. Yes. And also said, look, we are sitting over profits for the exposure that we have, which is well within the limit. That's what I understand they have said, and I've again read it through the media. They have very clearly said that their exposure is very well within the permitted limits, and that they are, even now with the valuation falling as well, they are still sitting over profit. So if that is the horse's mouth, as I refer to, word from the horse's mouth, but in general, both with the RBI, we do have the Financial Stability Board's meeting, which happens once in 6 months. We meet, even recently we have met. So I can only very clearly say, both the RBI and we, because of the FSB's meeting, Financial Stability Board's meeting, know that the Indian banking system, if anything, at this stage, for me to use this word, I want to use it with a sense of responsibility, like having gone through the twin balance sheet problem, Indian banking sector today is at a comfortable level, with their NPAs coming down to absolutely low levels, recovery is happening, and their position is very sound, which gets reflected in the fact that when they go to raise monies in the market, they are absolutely comfortably raising monies as well. So the entire macroeconomic analysis which any expert would do also highlights the fact that how comfortable the Indian banks are placed in. That cannot be that if they are at risk.
Some of the global investors as well, as a knee-jerk reaction, seem to have pulled out some money in the last couple of days. Some have put, fresh investments on hold. What would your message be to the global investors?
India remains as before an absolutely well-governed, stable government and also very well, regulated financial market. And as a result, I think the investor confidence which existed before shall continue even now. Our regulators are normally very, very stringent about certain governance practices, and therefore they should, one instance, however much talked about globally it may be, I would think is not going to be indicative of how well Indian financial markets are governed. So many lessons have been learned over the decades, and therefore I think our regulators have kept our market well in prime and prim condition.
All right. One instance, howsoever much it is talked about globally, does not reflect the strength of the Indian financial markets. Let me go across to our full panel joining us. That is the first big reaction from no less than the finance minister herself on the Adani controversy. Arun Anand is consulting editor with First Post, Deshratan Nigam, lawyer and political analyst, advocate Matthew Antony, spokesperson of the Congress Party, Gaurav Chaudhary is consulting editor with Network 18 and co-founder and CEO of Earshot Media, Gurcharan Das, senior economist, and Arvind Bali will be also joining us, CEO of the Telecom Sector Skill Council. Let me start with you, Arun Anand. What the finance minister essentially is saying is there are thousands of stocks that are publicly traded in the Indian stock markets. Just because one company and maybe a handful of stocks have gotten beat over the last week or so, that does not reflect the strength of the broader markets. And that's borne out by how the markets have played out in the aftermath of the budget. On all of the last 3 days, they have ended up in the green despite the Adani stocks falling as much as they have done. Would you agree with that, or would you disagree?
No, I will, absolutely agree with that. In fact, even though the Adani stocks were falling today also, but the market was rising. And if you look at, technically also the weightage of Adani Enterprises in the overall, Sensex. It's in the index. So the weightage is quite low. So I don't think it's going to... See, the thing is that it's an election year. So, and it was you see the timing, what is happening. And Congress has been pretty upfront about, targeting Adani. So, and I don't understand why this should be discussed in the parliament. Because most of the public sector banks and other investors, the institutional investors, have already come out with clarification. Why do they need to stall for one particular business house? Why do they need to stall? I fail to understand, but I think it's largely it has turned into a political kind of fight.
Okay, so let me ask Deshratan Nigam that, and I think that's a fair point. I don't think one company or one set of stocks, maybe 6 or 7 of them, represent the strength or otherwise of the Indian stock markets. And it's clear from how the financial markets have performed despite the beating of the Adani stocks. The question that the opposition is asking is, why then run away from some kind of an investigation? They believe, rightly or wrongly, that this entire thing is a scam. The best way for the government to clean up, or at least to show that it has nothing to hide, is to say, yes, let's have a JPC, let's have an inquiry, let's find out.
Zaka, let me point out that we have a very robust financial regulation system like SEBI, and there are other, institutions also under various provisions under the Companies Act as well. And therefore, if we bypass that system, they become redundant, like SEBI. Now, if you take over the functions of SEBI, what will SEBI do? SEBI is, I'm sure, keeping a watch on the entire system. So to have a JPC on this issue is not even required, because there are even the stock market and the other, they were watching it very closely. They have issued statements and they rightly pointed out that the exposure of, say, for example, LIC is 0.9% and 70% profit still, despite the lowdown. Okay. So it was certainly a storm for the Adani Group, but a storm in a teacup for a stock market. So a stock market has already withstood it and is still rising.
Okay, so let me ask Advocate Matthew Antony. I mean, the stock markets are rising. It is, as Deshratan Nigam said, a storm in a teacup for the broader markets. It represents less than 1% of SBI's loan book, and again, less than 1% of LIC's exposure. So what then is the opposition creating such a shindig about?
Thanks and good evening for having me to have this debate. Let me put it across to you very clearly. The question is about a fraud. The question is about an 88 questions raised on Adani's business transactions, business routing, and accounting scam. That is a question. It's a question of ethics here. And then, if LIC and SBI has invested on this one, where Adani is failing to come out with a descriptive answer for the questions raised, nor even moving ahead with his threat of suing the research company for the report without moving much on that one. The question is on the moral and ethical side of investment on how the LIC and SBI, which is largely a PSU enterprise, made the investment decisions without looking into such things, or whether they have overlooked it or not.
Advocate, let me just clarify. Let me just clarify on 2 points. No, one second. If
Yes.
you're alleging, and I'm willing to meet you halfway. If you're alleging, as the Hindenburg report seems to suggest, there was round tripping, ethicality, criminality, so on. There are multiple options, legal options that are available in front of you. Of course, there is the regulator SEBI, which has to order an inquiry. The RBI, I believe, has already asked banks for its exposure to Adani. And most importantly, you can file a criminal complaint, you can approach the courts. Why ask for a joint parliamentary committee? Why hold up the business of the House when this company, as the SBI chairman said, represents less than 1% of the loan book of the biggest public sector bank in this country? You're holding up Parliament. Hundreds of crores are being wasted on this one company when there are avenues, multiple avenues available to you to probe whether there was any criminality or whether there was any lack of morality in this alleged sort of round tripping, as you're saying.
How much of the Parliament's time was used for Vijay Mallya's case when it was not even 1% of SBI's exposure? How much of the time was used for the 2G scam when the court has acquitted everybody from that one? And how much of the Parliament's time was used for that one? You didn't have any concerns at that point of time because it was raised by the opposition at that point of time against the government. Now, there is a direct allegation against this particular business house that they are working in tandem with the ruling party. And the rules of the government has been leveraged to benefit this party, to benefit this business group at any given point of time. And it has come out in the form of a research. I am asking this question: why is Adani not taking any legal action rather than just coming out with a press statement?
No, they have said that they will take legal action against this research firm.
Do you need so much of time to take legal action?
How and in what form they will proceed, it's for them to decide. But let me ask Gaurav, I think one of the points that the opposition is making is this is not any other company, right? This is one of the biggest conglomerates in the country. And the opposition, rightly or wrongly, feels there are deep linkages between this company and the government. So isn't it incumbent on the government to say that, look, we have nothing to do with this company, let the law take its course, and whatever investigations there need to be done, let the investigations happen. The government hasn't said that yet.
So what the government, I see, on the opposition's charge, I think the opposition's charge is on favoritism, that this group has actually risen to a certain height because it happens to be the favorite of this government, and that is why its books needs to be opened up for further public scrutiny and also for parliamentary scrutiny. That is one point. But what the finance minister today said is that the exposure of SBI and LIC, which the opposition says is, I mean, these are institutions that are too big to fail in the technical sense too. And if their exposures, if they have very massive exposures in a group that is, facing the rout in the stock markets, then that needs to be investigated. But the finance minister has said that the exposures are within permissible limits. And shortly after finance minister told Network 18, the SBI chairman came out and said and quantified that exposure less than 1%. In fact, it's 0.88% of the total loan book, and likewise for LIC too. And in fact, despite the rout, and on the exposure, both the institutions are actually sitting on profits. A couple of hours after the finance minister's interview, the RBI has actually came out with a statement, not without naming the Adani Group, but has said that, as per the RBI's current assessment, the banking sector remains resilient and stable. And there is a monitoring purpose too, and there is a monitoring system too, which is called the large credit database system, where credits any credit above the value of rupees 5 crore is actually monitored by the RBI.
Okay.
Now, be that as it may, I think another point that the finance minister also made is that India's financial market regulatory system has a very strong architecture, both the RBI and the Securities Exchange Board of India.
Yeah.
And if anything were to happen, then they'll take, and the best practices are already in place. They're ring fences. The rules and laws are very well defined. So I think it is first for the SEBI and the RBI to investigate, examine the books, and if anything is amiss, then it should go to the Parliament.
Okay,
Because
I
otherwise
think that's a fair point, and I want to extend that to Gurcharan Das. We have seen in the past, in the Indian financial markets, in the Indian stock markets, some of these cases that have really blown up, whether it is the Wockhardt hospitals, whether it is the Satyam scam. I don't even want to go to, Harshit Mehta and Ketan Parekh. Leave that aside. But from all of those episodes, as the finance minister said, we have learnt our lessons. Our regulators have learnt their lessons. So surely they are capable enough, they have the instruments required to get to the bottom of this particular episode. So the government is leaving it to them. The opposition says that's a cover-up. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I think you're right that really it's the job of the regulator. However, we are a democracy, and we are a democracy where capitalism is still trying to find a comfortable home. So it is in such a democracy. I think if they want to have a parliamentary thing on it, is a democratic right of the opposition as well. So I would say that fine, let's play. We all as citizens want to know. The difficulty that in emerging markets is of crony capitalism, and so all of us want to know what is the truth, and let the regulators say, and if the parliament also wants to do it, let them do it. I think, it's the price we pay for being a democracy.
No, so the larger question that needs to be asked, Arvind Bali, is what Gurcharan Das said. This phrase crony capitalism is something that we've been hearing since definitely 2011-12 when the 2G scam blew up. That was the phrase that was used when 2G happened, and then subsequently when we had the NPA crisis and the sort of taper tantrum and the dollar crisis in 2013. Again, we heard this phrase crony capitalism. Now, a good 10 years later, the opposition is saying this episode best exemplifies crony capitalism. It's almost like the Indian capitalism story, as it were. I will say, the Indian economic liberalization story over the last 30 years since 1991. Just can't seem to get rid of this phrase and this problem and this anomaly called crony capitalism.
Yeah, so it is, I think, something very simple. Stock market is a free market, where every individual investor, every bank, everybody decides to make investment. And, they know that what is happening, they have their own decision making. But problem is, when something goes wrong, at that stage, everybody starts blaming each other, especially, because opposition gets a chance to blame government on that. I think all the decisions, whether, the way prices goes up, it is a clear demand and supply. It is not something which is managed by any individual, it is market-driven forces which decides. But then when the prices goes down, then I think you just find whom to make the scapegoat. And definitely, for opposition, is always government which is there. I think we have seen it in many cases. Like when we see all IPOs, when it comes, people make huge money. There's always upside. But if few IPOs fail, then, they start blaming the government, or they blaming the state, blaming the people that, it was not, or there was something or the other going wrong. So recently there was, sometime back, there was a IPO. When that IPO failed, everybody was blaming this was not done, that was not done.
Excuse me.
But when, people make double the money, triple the money, that time nobody complains.
Okay.
So in my opinion,
I think the point of concern is how much exposure do public sector institutions have to this particular set of companies, because that at the end of the day is public money. Otherwise, whatever monies this company has made, it's done so through the stock markets, through investors who knew fully well what they were getting into. They invested in these set of companies on the hope of profit, and that's the risk you take. But on the public sector exposure, we have the SBI chairman who spoke to our sister channel CNBC TV 18, and a specific question was asked to him about the exposure to the Adani Group, and this is what he had to say. And I'll come back to our guest right after this. Yeah.
So if you could actually elaborate, 0.9% of SBI's loan book is the total quantum of your exposure to Adani. If you could give us the absolute figures in terms of what is the fund-based and non-fund-based exposure in total to Adani.
It is everything put together.
So if you could give us the breakup.
I would not, I think non-fund-based exposure, I would only like to mention that they are essentially letter of credit and the bank guarantees, and these bank guarantees are the performance bank guarantees. And this is not against any of the equity raising or any such activity. We actually, breakup wise, maybe Swami, would you like to add something? If at all you have, or maybe you can.
Debt from us, and including a small investment of about 285 crores. So in all, the exposure total is about 0.88% as on 31st December. And as you clarified, sir, there is nothing which is against acquisition or against shares in this. Ritu, if you require any other granular data point that we can share offline with you.
In fact, we have not issued any guarantee towards securing any of the financial obligations or acquisitions either. So as I mentioned, that these are all performance guarantees or the financial guarantees, but done and which are required in the normal course of business.
All right. So he's clarifying two things, and I want to ask Advocate Anthony this. Number one, that the loan exposure is less than 1%. It's about 23,000 crores when the entire loan book is over 20 lakh crores. And secondly, this is basis assets as collateral. None of this is basis shares as collateral. So I think on both of those issues, the SBI chairman has clarified. And frankly, the only public interest is the exposure of public sector enterprises, whether it's LIC or SBI, to Adani. Otherwise, all the money he has raised, and whatever, call it whatever you want, Hindenburg can call it fraud, round tripping, whatever it is, that's between his investors and him. That has nothing to do with the public.
I have a couple of points to be raised to you. That is, the recent past, we have seen Satyam, and we have also seen Island FS collapse here. Both these companies, the exposures in the stock markets were relatively much lesser. At the same time, you can see almost $115 billion equivalent value erosion happening in the stock market basis on a report. And you have also seen this government acting on even the slightest of the allegations, using an ED, Enforcement Directorate, CBI, and the serious fraud offense officers, all put into utilization when they have a smallest of the allegation coming against it. There is a retail investors who doesn't know an iota of this, but had the trust in this company, now being ripped off of their investments. And I agree that the stock market is a profit and loss, agreed market, known by the investors. But at the same time, this is an unprecedented value erosion on a particular group stock. So what is the government doing about it for the retail investors?
No, again, I keep coming back to this. Once again, Advocate, whether or not investors lost money, and this 100 billion that you're talking about is not public money that's been lost. It's money that investors gave to this company, knowing full well that those investments could run sour.
I disagree.
I don't think there is public interest that is served or otherwise in that money, except of course the LIC exposure and the SBI exposure. Otherwise, it's investors. You want to invest in this company, you invest. You don't want to invest, you don't invest. That has nothing to do with public interest.
You made a statement that they made an investment.
Yes.
Fully aware about the company's details. Now, that fully aware part is being questioned. That is being considered as doubtful. That is being charged as fraud. And now in the last 2 weeks' time, what has Adani done apart from saying, you have got 14 days or you have got 10 working days? What has Adani done apart from the statement to make a legal procedure against the company which has
Again,
produced the report in their land or
how
here,
it chooses
for that
to
matter.
legally respond. I mean, they put out a statement saying that they will be suing
Did
this
you,
particular
will you,
research firm.
do you take so much
how
of time to
how they
respond to
do
such a
that
serious
is
allegation
up to them. Like I
with
said,
such kind of
I'm
value
coming
erosion?
back to the question of what is the public interest that is served or not. But Arun Anand, I think to be fair, okay, to be fair to Advocate Anthony and the rest of the opposition, what they're saying is when Satyam happened, when Wockhardt happened, when other so-called quote-unquote scams happened, there were multiple investigations. SEBI got into the act, the RBI got into the act, because the prevailing sort of understanding, the prevailing basis was that investors, retail investors have been taken for a ride by promoters of these companies. Now, again, I'm not saying all of what Hindenburg is saying is true, but even if there is an iota of truth in what Hindenburg is saying, isn't it the moral responsibility of investigating authorities, regulatory authorities, to find out if there's any truth in what this firm is saying?
You're absolutely right. It needs to be investigated, but as you have said, that there are regulatory authorities, and there is a standard operating procedure. That's why you have regulatory authorities, so that if any, this kind of thing happens, so they can, because it needs a very specialized kind of investigation. So when you talk about JPC and this thing, the Harshad Mehta scam was different. It was some trader who was manipulating the stock in the market and basically using the public money. So that is why JPC was required at that time. But now I don't think that there is a need of JPC. But yes, there is a need for investigation. And if the regulators feel that it needs a larger investigation within the policy framework also, so probably then they can recommend the. So at least I think we should not jump the gun. And
okay,
if we
Gaurav, what the opposition is saying, and again, this is their point of view. They are saying that look, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. This particular company is not just any company. The linkages with this government are very well known. So it must not just be above board, but it must be seen to be above board. That is what they're questioning. They're saying that the government is not doing enough to show that they are, hands off on this. Whatever investigators need to do, they do. And at the same time, they go out of their way to show that, look, we are putting public interest first. So if public money is there, which quote unquote has been taken for a ride, as Hindenburg says, then we need to get to the bottom of that. That's what the opposition is saying. Do they have a point?
So I'll just refer to two cases that have been cited here. One is the Satyam case. In the case of Satyam, in 2009, the promoter of Satyam actually came out and made a stunning confession that he had doctored the books of accounts for several years. So it was a confession by the promoter itself, and the criminality was, it came through an act of confession by the promoter himself. In the case of Vijay Mallya, and the Vijay Mallya case has also been cited, and it said that so considerable amount of parliamentary time has been expended on discussing the Vijay Mallya case. But in the case of Vijay Mallya, it was a loan default, and it was a loan default it was a loan repayment default by the group, by the company that Vijay Mallya at that point used to own and run and was the promoter. And the consortium of banks was not returned loans to the extent of about 13,000 odd crore. And then an FIR was filed, and the complaint was, in that case, was brought about by the banks themselves. So in most of the cases, in the loan default cases, the banks themselves have brought in the complaints because the borrowing company had defaulted on the loans. In this case, it is a research report by a third party, and there has been no complaint yet by any of the lenders yet. If they have been at the receiving end, or their loans have not been repaid, or they have been default on repayment of loans, etc. I think that the first thing of flagging that will come from the lenders themselves, and those checks and balances are now well and truly in place, and that is what the finance minister was today trying to say when she said that India's financial markets are very well regulated because of the various instances and the experience over the last several decades. But having said that, on the point whether this particular group is seen to be too close to this government, and that is why the government should go ahead and actually go the extra mile to launch an investigation, that is a fair point. But that investigation has to be first launched by the regulators in public interest rather than Parliament itself, because this requires very specialized investigation, and that is the SEBI and the RBI are the two first investigators that should actually
Get into
examine
this. Okay.
what has been put
So,
out
so
in
let me
public
ask
domain
Gurcharan
by
Das.
Hindenburg.
So,
Yeah.
do you agree with Gaurav's point that in the case of Vijay Mallya, for example, it was the lenders and the loan was defaulted on. They were the ones who sort of raised the issue first. That is materially different from a historically known short-selling firm coming out and saying that this is our research, this is what we believe, and therefore we are going short on this stock. It's not. It's apples and oranges.
Yeah, well, I think that he's right, and there are differences. However, it's a bigger issue in the sense that India is frankly a young country, and certainly our economy only began from 1991. So we are a very young country. We are establishing institutions. There's a lack of trust. And what it is, therefore, I would say that anything we can do now as a country to bring transparency into the system. I mentioned the word crony capitalism last time. Now, that's the view of a lot of people. And that's not a good thing to have. Many countries go through this. America went through this stage. And so I would say, in the interest of creating trust, I mean, opposition will always try to find, particularly when they have no other, nothing else to talk about, they will try to latch on to any kind of news.
Okay.
I would just say that if everything we can do, the regulators, absolutely, regulators have a job first. But, there's a lot of distrust of regulators in our country. The regulators are they were supposed to be independent, but they are often retired officials of the same department. That's why the railway privatization thing, it didn't get bidders because the regulator was a former railway person. So I feel that there's a lot, India still has further to go. I completely agree with the view that things have improved. Things have improved. But what we are doing is carrying baggage also from the past. And
okay.
Anything
I'll give Mr. Bali the final word. I think the larger point that needs to be made is, and I think Gaurav is right, when Kingfisher defaulted, it was not just about one company. The broader market was affected because of it. When the Walkhard scam came to light, it was the entire market that got affected by it. So was the case with Satyam. Here in this instance, at least in the last 3 days since the budget got presented, and the government's view may be that, the budget itself got hijacked because of this entire scandal. But the fact remains that for the last 3 days, despite this Adani crisis, the broader markets have ended in the green, and substantially so, including today where it ended more than 400 points up. So doesn't that show the limited nature of weightage of the Adani Group of companies on the broader markets, and B, that the broader markets are looking at other factors, not just this one set of companies?
No, I think it is mainly because it has become a very big issue. I also invest in U.S. market, and there's a car maker in U.S. So their stock tanked like anything. But then there was no such issue, not big debates, and within few weeks it returned back. It came back quite substantially. I think here also, I think time should be given to such companies, because ultimately, it is not that it is everything is sentiment. The kind of sentiments you create in the stock market, and now so much of negative sentiments have been created. Then obviously, it is going to have an impact. So the best is, I think, such things should be left, because when the investigation starts, there's further negativity, a lot of negative news, and negative news ultimately keeps bringing the stock down. The best is, I think, all such companies should be left the way demand and supply.
I got to wrap up. I'm completely out of time. I'm sorry I'm interrupting, but I will just end by saying that sentiment or otherwise, I think that's a very ephemeral sort of thing in the markets. Ultimately, any company will be judged by its fundamentals, and if you're an investor out there, judge by the fundamentals of this group of companies, whether or not you believe it has the staying power, it has the finances, it has the ability to repay its loans, or whether it is over-leveraged and overexposed. That's a call that individual investors have to make. Meanwhile, we'll take a quick break here in the program. When we come back, will a suspected spy balloon that was hovering over Montana in the United States worsen what is already frayed ties between Beijing and Washington? There is an upcoming visit of the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to Beijing, which is really now in the crosshairs after this incident, this bizarre incident and its ramifications, right on the other side of this quick break.
Is being kicked off today, this week, in fact, by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and National Security Advisor Doval. So a lot of things that we're doing together bilaterally are also enhanced by the fact that India is chairing the G20 this year.
I want to talk about the other autocracy, as you called it. There's been this ongoing standoff between India and China for the better part of the last 2 years. What is your best understanding of why China has tried to unilaterally change the status quo?
Well, obviously we oppose any unilateral efforts to, whether it's civilian, military, to change the status quo. I'm not going to speak for why China's doing what it is doing, but obviously it would be far better to try to settle these issues at the diplomatic table. In the past, India has had some success there, and I know that you are continuing to try, and we encourage that.
Just to take that conversation forward, the Indo-Pacific, of course, is a big priority for the United States, as indeed it is for India. Where do you see the future of Quad? We're already seeing, countries like Japan, for example, which is a pacifist constitution, did not have an aggressive standing army. Now they're really thinking seriously about changing that posture. Do you see an increasing militarization of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, we're trying to do actually the opposite, Saka. We're trying to ensure, through the cooperation that we have, India, Australia, Japan, U.S., to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, not only in our own interest, but in global interest. 50% of global trade goes through the Taiwan Straits. So the work that we do in Quad is about keeping things open, keeping them free, but it's also about advancing maritime security, it's about advancing climate goals, it's advancing food security, all of these kinds of things that the democracies need to work on together, even as the autocracies work to change the global rules of the road.
You talked about Taiwan. There is increasing concern that there could be some kind of a military flare-up between China and Taiwan. We even had recently an American general say that in 2025 there's going to be a military action between China and Taiwan. What are the conversations you're having with the Chinese and with the Taiwanese to try and avoid that situation?
As you know, Zaka, President Biden sat down with President Xi Jinping last autumn in Bali to try to talk president to president about our responsibilities as big powers to maintain peace, to maintain stability, about the fact that, our One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act together have kept the peace, have been a status quo situation that has helped us all avoid conflict for decades and decades and decades, and that if there is an effort to change that status quo now, and particularly by force, we're all going to suffer. So that's a conversation the presidents have had. We will now continue it in other channels with the Chinese. What we want is to ensure that we have crisis management release valves, that we can talk to each other as necessary. But
a suspected Chinese spy balloon has been flying over the United States. According to U.S. defense officials, the balloon floated into U.S. airspace a couple of days ago, but American intelligence has been tracking it well before that. The balloon is believed to have flown over northwest United States, where there are sensitive air bases and nuclear missiles in underground silos. Fighter jets were flown to examine the balloon while it was flying above Montana. As per the Pentagon, the balloon is currently traveling at an altitude well above commercial air traffic and does not pose any military or physical threat to people on the ground. Spy balloons were first used back in the 1860s. What exactly are these spy balloons and why are they used far more than satellites are for espionage purposes? It typically involves a camera suspended beneath a balloon that floats above a given area thanks to wind currents. The equipment attached to the balloons could even include radar and solar power. Balloons typically operate at 24,000 to 37,000 meters. That is well above the commercial airlines, which almost never fly more than 12,000 meters in altitude. So why are they used instead of satellites? While they don't offer the same level of surveillance as satellites do, they are easier to retrieve, they are much cheaper to launch. The balloons can also scan more territory from a lower altitude and spend more time over a given area because they move far more slowly than satellites do. One of the most notable examples of spy balloon usage was by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviets attached cameras to spy balloons to keep tabs on Western military activities and installations. This led to countermeasures by the West, including efforts to shoot down these balloons or disrupt their signals. In 2010, the United States military detected a high-altitude balloon which was equipped with cameras and other surveillance equipment near its base in Okinawa in Japan. It is believed that the balloon was launched by the Chinese military and it was being used for espionage purposes. And then again in 2014, a Chinese military unit reportedly launched a high-altitude balloon near the Pacific island of Guam. The incident sparked tensions between Washington and Beijing. It also raised concerns about Chinese military activities close to U.S. military bases. Now, China has said that the balloon was a civilian airship that was used for research that blew off course. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has insisted that China will not violate any international law.
中国是负责任的国家，一贯严格遵守国际法，无意侵犯任何主权国家的领土和领空。关于这个气球的问题，刚刚我已经讲了，我们正在了解核实情况，希望双方能够共同冷静谨慎处理。
And we're getting breaking news in this regard. According to Bloomberg News, the Biden administration has decided to postpone Secretary of State Antony Blinken's upcoming visit to Beijing. This is after the Chinese surveillance balloon was detected over Montana. Sanjay Suri has more details on this. Sanjay, this would arguably be the first time that a balloon has curtailed a diplomatic visit.
Rather odd happenings in the sky above the United States, of course. And as you say, the Chinese have said that this was a meteorological data gathering balloon that somehow blew off course. The question is, how will we ever know? Are the Chinese waiting for the winds to blow it back over China, for then China to retrieve it onto the ground and collect data about the weather? Or is it the US suspicions that are right? And that suspicion, of course, primarily is that this is a spy balloon. This is not a small balloon. We are told it's the size of about 3 buses. It certainly carries a lot of data on board. But in this current spat between China and the US over exactly what kind of balloon this is, it's hard to see how we will get to a final determination what's going to happen to it. Of course, there are demands to shoot it down, led predictably by Donald Trump, rather fond of shorthand and dramatic measures. But unless that happens, unless we come to some sort of a conclusion, and that question really is uncertain. It is, in fact, if you like, a question that is up in the air.
All right, it literally is up in the air. Sanjay, thanks for that. Let me go across also to CNN correspondent Alex Marquardt, who's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Alex, first things first, reports, including this one that I cited a moment ago from Bloomberg News, suggesting that the Biden administration has decided to postpone Secretary of State Antony Blinken's upcoming visit to Beijing. What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, we have now confirmed this. CNN is reporting that Blinken is postponing his trip to Beijing that was due to take place next week. This was just confirmed by State Department officials just moments ago. We had a briefing call with them. They said that this Chinese balloon that is now over American airspace is a clear violation of American sovereignty, and that it would not be constructive at this time to go forward with this meeting. This meeting due to take place in just a couple of days. Secretary Blinken was due to leave very soon in order to get to Beijing. This was going to be the highest level meeting of a Biden administration official in China since President Biden came into office following President Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping at the G20 in Bali back in November. Now this meeting is off, but they are saying it is postponed. It has not been canceled. They do plan to put this meeting back on the table, reschedule it when the conditions are right. But when asked by CNN what those conditions would look like, they were not very specific. The Pentagon has said very clearly that this is not the first time that Chinese surveillance and intelligence balloons have flown over the United States. What's different in this case is that it appears to be loitering for a longer period of time, but more importantly, that this is happening, as the State Department has said, on the eve of this very important trip by Secretary Blinken to Beijing. So the fact that this is happening right now raised questions immediately as to whether Secretary Blinken would actually go, and now we know that that trip has been postponed. We know that urgent and angry messages have been sent to Beijing, both through the highest-ranking Chinese officials here at the embassy in Washington and through the U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
And Alex, what are the options before U.S. officials at this point of time vis-a-vis this balloon? Is shooting down the balloon one of those options? Already we're seeing former President Donald Trump saying shoot the balloon down, and I'm sure so are many other Republican supporters of his.
Yeah, we are hearing a lot of people saying that they wish that that was the course of action that President Biden was taking. I've spoken with fighter jet pilots who would tell you that it's very simple to shoot this thing down. President Biden did get a briefing in which he asked for military options. He was told by top military officials that it was not a good idea to shoot this balloon down because of the potential damage that could be done to people and property on the ground. The Pentagon believes this is not currently a threat to the American population, to Homeland Security, and they say that they have taken steps to limit the surveillance and intelligence gathering capabilities of this balloon. Now, as you've seen, this balloon has floated over Montana, which is quite sparsely populated. And so we've heard some people, including several Republicans, saying, why not just shoot it down where there is barely anyone out there? But the administration is arguing that for the potential of that damage of a falling craft, while right now they say it is not posing any danger, but it is just remarkable to think that right now, as we speak, there is this Chinese spy balloon, according to the Pentagon, floating over American airspace.
All right, Alex Marquardt, we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for joining us live from Washington, D.C. for us. Meanwhile, let's open this up to our guests. Einar Tangen is a political affairs commentator. He's joining us live from Beijing. And Glenn Clark is a former CIA officer. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Einar, I know, I can't think of another time when a senior diplomatic official canceled his trip bases a balloon sort of parading into American airspace. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people in Beijing who are looking at this as half tragic, half comic. But the fact is that this is, at least the way the American officials see it, the way Pentagon officials have been briefing, this is a serious violation of American airspace.
Well, as we all know, a balloon is something that is blown by the winds and is not controllable. So this idea that somehow the Chinese have as you put it, a balloon the size of 3 buses and they're able to maneuver it wherever they want, highly improbable. And the fact is, this is not the Cold War of Russia and the United States. The accuracy of the telescopes and these satellites going around the world is very, very precise. They don't need these balloons. So, from Beijing's point of view, they have an errant civilian balloon that's going around. You have speculation on behalf. Easiest way to do this is, as you pointed out, why not shoot it down over Montana? They might kill a buffalo or 2. That would be about it. And quite frankly, they could settle the issue of whether this was a civilian or a military craft. So at this juncture, it just seems that this is being overblown as an excuse to cancel Biden's visit to China.
Glenn Carl, Blinken. Why is the United States so reluctant to shoot it down? Because, all right, we'll try and go across to Glenn Carl. There are various considerations you have to take into account before making that decision. One is, of course, is it materially relevant to shoot it down? Is the damage that's being done by this balloon so grave that U.S. officials have no other option but to shoot it down? Also, we don't know what's on board that balloon. It is possible that there could be destructive material on board that balloon. which could pose a danger to folks on the ground. Let's try and see if we can go back to Glenn Carl, because I want to try and understand, what are the considerations that security officials take into account before making that decision whether or not to shoot such a thing down. Is it simply just utility, or is it also the danger it may pose if it is shot down? Because if it's clearly dangerous enough to call off a diplomatic visit, then it's dangerous enough to be floating in the air over American airspace.
Was that to me? I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, that was to you, Mr. Carl. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, no, I think we're in a pretty classic diplomatic intelligence dance, and to shoot it down would be an escalation. Everyone knows that espionage occurs. Most countries do it. Here, there's a long history of Chinese intelligence balloons. They aren't the only ones to use them, but they have been caught here red-handed, if that's the appropriate metaphor to use with regard to a balloon. So the classic response is to diplomatically say, we've caught you out. You better stop. And then the response will be, as it has been, there's a misunderstanding. This is a weather balloon that has strayed. Mm-hmm. And then usually both parties will back off. The perpetrator will tend to back off for a time. To shoot it down would escalate matters. But if China were to continue sending uncontrolled balloons over the United States, then probably the United States would respond. But at present, it's a classic diplomatic intelligence stance playing out traditionally.
But how did it make its way all the way from China through many of the countries that it had to traverse, including Canada, to get to U.S. airspace, as it were?
Well, this is an interesting point. I'm hardly an expert on the slipstream on aviation or on balloons. However, there is literally a over 100-year history of using balloons for intelligence. As you pointed out, by the way, it's about the best summary of the use of balloons for intelligence that I've heard from any source that you gave. In World War II, Japan sent them by using prevailing wind currents. Japan's intent during World War II was to drop bombs. This is not the case with this balloon. What is notable to me is that the Chinese balloons do appear to be controlled, at least to some extent. They have flown over Guam, which is not a large target, and now over the United States, specifically over sensitive sites. So they appear to have some means of controlling and guiding them, as opposed to just tossing them up into the slipstream.
Aina Tangent, what's the view in Beijing now that this visit itself has been called off, and we haven't had such a high-level diplomatic visit to Beijing for a number of years now, certainly not since the onset of COVID. And the feeling was, after Joe Biden and Xi Jinping met at the G20 in Bali a few months ago, that there was going to be a degree of normalcy back into the relationship. Now with this episode and the visit being cancelled in the background of this episode, are we back to blowing hot and blowing cold between China and the United States?
Well, let's take a look at that statement. A couple of days ago, a four-star U.S. general predicted that there would be a war in 2025. Since 2020, the U.S. has been reforming its Naval Marine Corps to fight in islands directly at China, mentioning China as an adversary. You've also had all of the banning of Huawei, the instigation of trying to get both Japan and South Korea to not only join into the situation in Ukraine, but also to come together into the Quad. Come together in an alliance against China. So, this idea that somehow the provocation is on China's side is kind of ridiculous. This balloon theory that you can't see a balloon that's the size of 3 buses, which it clearly is visible to people, as the pictures you are showing are, that it could be stealthily sent into the U.S. is kind of nonsense. And the idea that you need these balloons in order to gather information is also nonsense. These satellites are not 100 years old. They're up to date, and they can tell you how many shoelaces you have on your shoes. So it's not credible. I can understand that Washington wants to spin this as some sort of diplomatic incident, but if they were serious about it, they have two options. One, they can disable it through electronic countermeasures that would prevent any kind of signal from getting out, or they could shoot it down. But they run the risk, if they shoot it down, of discovering that it is in fact a civilian weather balloon, and then they would have egg on their faces and be very embarrassed.
All right, we'll leave it at that. We'll see how this story plays itself out. Like I said in my opening comments, it's not the first time that such balloons have been used for espionage purposes. China says this has nothing to do with espionage. It's just a civilian, a research balloon that was looking at weather patterns. The United States is not buying that. For whatever reason, this has become such a serious incident that a high-level diplomatic visit that was supposed to happen in a couple of days from now has been called off. Even if the U.S. doesn't say it's because of this reason, it's clear that in the backdrop of this balloon incident, that is having a big bearing on why that visit was called off. We'll see how the story plays out. In the meanwhile, if you've been tuned in, thanks very much. I'm Zaka Jacob. I'll see you again Monday night, same time.
But the weapons aren't working too well out there, so we've been having the conversation about diversifying away from that kind of dependency, doing more with the U.S. and with other friends in the defense sector. And of course, on the energy side, India, as you know, buys on the spot market, so it always goes for the best price. So one of the things that we've been talking about before and during and after the decision on an oil price cap by many of us was that this would actually benefit India. So even though you're buying more Russian oil, the fact that you're paying cheaper prices for it is good for India, but it also dries up the revenue that would otherwise contribute to Putin's war machine. So, this is where we are now. You're going to buy your oil from somewhere. What we want to ensure is that you're not fueling the war.
I started off by saying that this is India's G20 year. It's a big
big year.
A year for India. You must have seen billboards and hoardings all around town talking about the G20. The last G20 in Bali was sort of overshadowed by this war. Do you reckon in 8 months' time when India hosts the G20, we would have been seeing the end of this war, or will that still be the dominant theme, as it were?
Zaka, if I had a crystal ball, I would love for the Ukrainian people for this conflict to be over. But I think what's more important is that as host of the G20, India has a hugely strong role to play in the message that all of the big democracies are sending to the two big autocracies that are trying to change the rules of the road by force and coercion, whether it's Russia or whether it's China. So we've been doing a lot of talking together with India as you get ready to host about the things that we need to work on together. We need to ensure resiliency in our supply chains. We need to ensure that China can't continue to indebt countries and not follow the global rules of the road there. I'm off to Sri Lanka after this. We talked about that, about our responsibilities for some of the challenges, whether it is in health. We've worked together on COVID. We're now working together on food security, which is obviously exacerbated by Russia's war on Ukraine. We have other work together to do to ensure resilient supply chains. Some of that work is being kicked off this week, in fact, by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and National Security Advisor Doval. So a lot of things that we're doing together bilaterally are also enhanced by the fact that India is chairing the G20 this year.
I want to talk about the other autocracy, as you called it. There's been this ongoing standoff between India and China for the better part of the last 2 years. What is your best understanding of why China has tried to unilaterally change the status quo?
Well, obviously we oppose any unilateral efforts to, whether it's civilian, military, to change the status quo. I'm not going to speak for why China's doing what it is doing, but obviously it would be far better to try to settle these issues at the diplomatic table. In the past, India has
Namaskar, this is First Post and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Tonight, our focus is on Ukraine. Kiev couldn't get its fighter jets, so it has now shifted its focus towards India. It wants India to be sanctioned. What for? For buying Russian oil. A Ukrainian lawmaker is in the US to push for this. He says India is pursuing quote-unquote material economic interests. We say as far as the demand for sanctions goes, he is whipping a dead horse. The West has tried pushing sweeping sanctions on Russian oil before. They haven't worked. Tonight, we'll tell you about Ukraine's material interests, though. It involves a terrorist state in South Asia, a country that backs terror groups, Pakistan. We'll tell you all about its relationship with Ukraine, also a report on that Chinese balloon, the Chinese spy balloon that everyone is watching in the US, and a sensational charge against Pfizer. A report claims it is engineering mutations of the Wuhan virus. We'll tell you if the claims hold any water. First, the headlines. Setback for US lawmaker Ilhan Omar. She's been ousted from a powerful House Foreign Affairs Committee. She'd caused quite a stir in India last year with a visit to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir.